The Battle of the Somme is one of those horrible events in history that everyone knows about, but almost nobody actually understands just how horrible it was. That's because statistics don't show you the real horrors through the eyes of an individual soldier who was there. And the more you look through the eyes of soldiers that were there, the worse it gets. So, some of what you're going to hear, you won't forget easily. Now, like we always do, let's go to where everything began and move from there. By the spring of 1916, the Western Front had been frozen in place for nearly 17 months. After the War of Movement ended, both sides had dug in along a 470 miles long, continuous line of fortified trenches. In less than 5 months of the opening campaigns, the armies on the Western Front had suffered nearly 2 million casualties, out of which 500,000 soldiers were killed. And to make everything only worse, the front lines would barely shift more than 10 miles in either direction for the next 3 years. No one knew how to break this stalemate caused by modern machine guns and artillery used at such a scale for the first time in history, and soldiers were just staying there and dying. Before the Somme offensive, the British fought no significant battles on their sector of the Western Front, yet still suffered over 100,000 casualties. That is roughly 600 men put out of action every single day due to shelling, sniping, disease, and trench raids. The Somme sector, specifically, was one of the quietest stretches of the entire front. Little fighting had occurred there since 1914, and the troops on both sides had adopted what historians call a live and let live system, meaning that soldiers wouldn't shoot if the other side wasn't shooting, because by that point they had all pretty much figured out how pointless this war was, and they just wanted to make it through alive. But the politicians and military leaders had very different plans, as always. Now, before we get into the battle itself, you need to understand who the British soldiers actually were, and why they were marching straight into horrors that perhaps could have been avoided. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, it didn't have anywhere near the massive conscript army that France and Germany had. Britain had a small, well-trained professional force, but tiny in numbers compared to the other major powers. Just 3 days after the declaration of war, Kitchener, who was the Secretary of War, went public and asked for 100,000 volunteers. But what happened next surprised even him. In just 1 month, almost 300,000 men signed up. In September 1914 alone, 460,000 men enlisted. And by the time conscription was introduced in 1916, roughly 2.5 million men had voluntarily joined the British Army. But doesn't that sound a bit suspicious? Why were so many young men choosing to go to what would become the most horrific war in human history? Well, at the time, they genuinely didn't know just how bad it was going to get, and we can't blame them for wanting to support their country. But there's more to it than that. Britain hadn't fought a major European war in a century, and for most people, war still had a somewhat romantic or honourable image to it. The idea of being a real man, going off to fight, coming home as a hero, with girls looking at you differently, bringing back stories of your bravery and victory over the enemy, was pretty much the picture for a lot of guys joining the army. And on top of that, they were being deliberately manipulated. It went so far that groups of women were sent to hand out white feathers, which is a symbol of cowardice, to any man they saw in civilian clothes who looked young and healthy enough to serve. The idea spread rapidly across Britain and became a form of public shaming that was genuinely vicious. Men who were home on medical leave, men who had already been discharged after being wounded, men in reserved occupations doing work essential to the war effort, men who were simply too young, all of them were targeted. There is a documented case of a Victoria Cross recipient, a decorated war hero, being handed a white feather on his way to receive his medal because he was in civilian clothes, and in their opinion, he should be fighting the war instead of staying home like a little coward. The pressure this created in communities was enormous and very real. Add to that the fact that Britain in 1914 had significant unemployment in many industrial areas, and the army was offering regular pay, food, clothing, and shelter. And then there was perhaps the biggest factor of all, one directly responsible for the horrors at the Somme being even worse. When your friends, your neighbors, your family members are all enlisting, you can't exactly be the one who stays home and lets them go without you. So the military leaders, or propaganda artists, call them what you want, came up with the idea of what became known as the PALS battalions. Instead of mixing men from all over the country into random units like it's usually military practice, they would let men who enlisted together choose to serve together. Your battle buddies would be your brothers, your friends, your neighbors. It made enlisting easier, and it sounded great in theory. But as you're going to hear, it would turn out to be one of the most catastrophic mistakes in British military leadership. So, like we said, the stalemate had set in, it was clear that neither side was going anywhere, and the Allied commanders had to figure out what to do about 1916. Joseph Joffre was the French commander-in-chief and the most senior Allied commander on the Western Front, which meant the British, as the junior partner in the alliance, largely had to follow his strategic lead. The French and British leaders met and agreed on a massive combined offensive, something large enough to finally break the deadlock. And the place they chose was the Somme Valley in northern France, but not because it had any particular strategic value, not because there were any critical objectives there that would change the course of the war if captured. The Somme was chosen for one reason and one reason only. It was the point on the map where the British and French armies happened to meet. That was it. The original plan had the French carrying the main weight, with around 40 divisions attacking on a 25-mile front south of the river, with the British providing support to the north. But then on February 21st, 1916, Germany launched its massive attack on France at Verdun, and everything began to fall apart. By the time the Somme offensive was due to begin, the French were being bled out exactly as the Germans had intended, and because of that, their contribution to the Somme began to shrink dramatically. First from 40 divisions down to 22, then to 13, and on the actual first day of the battle, only 5 French divisions attacked south of the river. What had been designed as a primarily French offensive with British support had become a primarily British offensive, with the French barely holding on beside them. Meanwhile, Joffre was strongly urging British commander Douglas Haig to begin the attack sooner than Haig felt ready. Haig wanted mid-August, which would have given more time to train his inexperienced troops, stockpile ammunition, and properly prepare. Joffre told him that if the British waited that long, the French army would already be dead before the battle even began. The start date was pushed forward to July 1st, cutting 6 weeks of preparation time that Haig had argued he desperately needed. Henry Rawlinson, who commanded the British Fourth Army, was the man who would actually run the Somme offensive on the ground day to day. Unlike Haig, who was a cavalry officer dreaming of a massive breakthrough through which his cavalry would charge and deliver a decisive blow, Rawlinson had a more realistic idea, and one that was perhaps actually achievable. He'd seen enough failed offensives by this point to know that a massive breakthrough probably wasn't going to happen, so he preferred what was called the bite and hold approach. Attack one specific section of the enemy line, capture it, dig in, use artillery and machine guns to fight off counterattacks, and move up, then repeat. Slow, but far safer and far more grounded in reality. So you had 3 men in charge with 3 different visions of how this should go. And here is what they eventually agreed on, after considerable headache and disagreement. Given the forces he had and the ground in front of him, Rawlinson proposed attacking on a front of about 20,000 yards, limiting objectives to the German first defensive line only. Bite and hold, take the first line, consolidate, then plan the next step. Haig rejected this. He widened the attack front to 25,000 yards and ordered that both the German first and second defensive lines should be captured in a single assault. He also wanted cavalry standing by to exploit a breakthrough. This disagreement had horrible consequences for the artillery, which was the heart of the entire plan. The whole attack was based on the belief that a week-long bombardment would destroy German resistance so completely that the infantry would face minimal opposition when they went over the top. Rawlinson had assembled around 1,400 guns for this bombardment, and over the 7 days starting June 24th, they fired somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 million shells, which was the largest artillery bombardment in history up to that point. Which sounds like an absolutely overwhelming amount of firepower. But because Haig had widened the front and insisted on targeting 2 defensive lines simultaneously instead of 1, those guns were now spread across a much larger area. When you work out the actual weight of shell fire hitting each yard of German trench, the bombardment was less concentrated than some much smaller British operations earlier in the war. The guns were simply stretched too thin. Additionally, the bombardment had 2 other serious problems. The first was that roughly 30% of those shells simply didn't explode. This happened because of the shell crisis of 1915, when Britain wasn't producing nearly enough ammunition, so production was massively ramped up at speed, quality control suffered, and hundreds of thousands of faulty shells ended up in the supply chain. The second problem was the type of shells being used. About 2/3 of the shells of the entire bombardment were shrapnel shells. It works by spraying lead balls and shrapnel forward in a cone when it detonates, which is absolutely lethal against troops standing in the open, but almost completely useless for the actual jobs that needed doing here. Shrapnel cannot effectively cut barbed wire. It cannot collapse a deep underground dugout. It has no blast effect. The only shell that could do those things was high explosive. But high explosive rounds were were still relatively new in production, and there simply weren't enough of them. Plus, they were mostly smaller caliber, so they didn't have the power they needed to do those things. So, the bombardment was overly spread out, riddled with duds, and firing the wrong type of shell for most of its targets. Now, if all this wasn't enough, the Germans had been sitting in this sector since late 1914, with very little fighting to worry about, and they had used those 18 months very well to prepare. They built defenses designed to survive exactly the kind of bombardment the British were planning. The chalk geology of the Somme was perfect for this because chalk is solid